Thank you. Okay, so we've had a long break. I hope you had a good break and got to relax a bit over mid-semester break, and also last week, which then was a bit more quiet because I was still away. AT1 is in. AT2 I haven't started correcting yet, but I'll try to get the results to you by next week. Bonus quiz. So some of the people, most of the people should have their grades released by now for the bonus quiz. Do not check that right now, please, but check that later. But I'm really terribly behind on that due to conference travel and all kinds of other stuff. Much more behind than I wanted to be. So I would just say for this time, for the second bonus quiz from the second assignment, I had already said, I think I had said by tomorrow 10 a.m. or something like that. I would say in light of my lateness, deadline for that second bonus quiz is just super relaxed. So if somebody still wants to get that in, everything fine. You should have your comments first. That is completely my mistake, and I'm sorry about it. That said, we'll move into the lecture, and this is actually something that will be quite important for the third assignment task, and I will a couple of times be kind of alerting you to things that will be relevant to think about for AT3. So brief reminder, first of all, what we did 2 weeks ago before that big break. So we had begun to look at ways of evaluating complex arguments, and we had really looked at two different types of complex arguments in that respect. And the question here was going to be not so much how does the conclusion is or isn't the conclusion supported by the premises? What is the connection between the premises and the conclusion? But the new question we had been asking, and we had been depicting that with argument maps, was exactly the relationship between premises. And we had distinguished two different styles or two different forms of relationships between premises, where the one was exactly linked premises and that kind of argument, and that was really the standard kind of argument. So most of the examples that we looked at so far in previous weeks actually had codependent or linked premises. In that case, you would need both of them working together to support the conclusion. You couldn't have just one on their own. And the other example was independent or convergent premises, so kind of indicated by this schematic argument map down here, where in principle that premise on its own would lend some support to the conclusion. So that was kind of the idea of having basically in principle separate arguments that just happen to have the same conclusion. And obviously if you're having an argument, if you develop an argument like that, it will be much harder to refute, right? You're creating a lot more work for your opponent, because they basically have to separately attack all of those independent or principally independent arguments. So that was the one kind of complex argument that we had looked at. The other kind of complex argument, which often involves or can involve, as we see here, a mixture of linked and independent premises, is going to be arguments involving sub-arguments. And we also saw that in principle every argument at some point or another, especially if it's interesting, is going to depend on further sub-arguments, whether this is made explicit or not. So just a sub-argument being any premise that supports a sub-conclusion that then itself functions as a premise for another conclusion, right? So you basically have those kinds of hierarchies. And you can also see, even if something like this, even if your main argument was sound in itself or valid, if you could show that this this sub-argument doesn't work. This sub-conclusion, which then is premise one for that argument, is not itself supported. That would be a wonderful way of undermining that argument. So again, to pay some attention to that aspect. And that is also going to be something that is going to reoccur in later assignment tasks and final exams as well, so it is quite important. For argument evaluation, this meant, just to refresh your memories, that we're adding 2 new questions to the list of questions that we ask for argument evaluation, namely exactly looking at the relationship between premises and looking whether premises are supported by sub-arguments. And the thing to see here, if it got complex, if it got confusing, especially some of the exercises that I had uploaded at the end of the tutorials were actually quite complex, where you had these huge exploding argument maps, kind of something like that. The process in itself isn't complex if you break it down into little subtasks. So that was the idea, kind of identifying little units within these complex arguments can really make things easier and kind of order the whole process of what you're doing there. Is that so far all clear? Because then we can move on to the next step of what we're going to be doing today, and that is going to be focusing our attention on another aspect of argument evaluation that we have not talked about so much so far. So far we've been talking about validity, about the structure of complex arguments. And today we're going to look in a bit more detail at exactly that first blue question here. So how do we really know whether a premise is true? How do we really know whether or not to accept a premise? And there are different questions we can ask, but kind of one of the main ones that we're constantly confronted with in everyday life is exactly evaluating appeals to authority. Is the source that is defending an argument, is that a reliable source? Is it a trustworthy source? And how can you find out? And this is a tricky one because this is completely central to most of the arguments that you're going to develop on your own. It's completely central to most of the arguments that you're confronted with, but it's also really easy to slip into kind of informal fallacies, and we'll be looking at some informal fallacies relating to appeals to authority in the second half of the lecture. So it's kind of going to have those 2 parts. So authority, why would you be interested in evaluating appeals to authority? Well, as I just said, they're basically everywhere, right? This list is itself highly selective, right? These are just very selective examples of situations in which you would be confronted with authoritative or putative experts of different types, right? News reports. The internet has made things much more complex because you're now also dealing with blog posts and various kind of informal or harder to identify experts. You have situations like that in legal cases with witness or expert testimony, but you would actually also have it in everyday situations where somebody just said, well, why should I believe this? Well, I know because I've experienced X, I've been through X, I've been there myself. So all of those would be situations where in some sense you would have to very quickly decide whether this is actually a trustworthy source. This is a situation as well, right? For better or for worse, you have to trust my expertise on certain things as well. So teaching situations. Research scientists, will be looking at some examples like that later in the tutorials. And it's not just people, so it's important to see that it's not just people, it's obviously also going to be books, encyclopedia, and so on and so forth. So one huge topic, so I'm just going to give you some examples to make this a bit more vivid, and some of you might know these, but some of you might not. So a huge topic, I think, especially with what the internet has been doing in recent years, right, is going to be some form of media literacy. And this is a very historic example that some of you I can already see know, right? How many people do not know this? Right, so 1930s, Mars is attacking, radio broadcast. They interrupted it several times. I read up on this again yesterday to get it right, and in the end you had supposedly something like a mass panic ensuing because people actually thought that Martians were attacking a farm in New Jersey, which was just the Halloween rendition of, H.G. Wells. Kind of a problem for critical, well, in one way it was saying, well, okay, this is radio broadcast telling the story, so they were kind of blindly trusting that authority. People weren't really listening, so before and after the broadcast, they did say, this is just a science fiction story, but it was still rendered in such a believable manner that apparently many people did believe it after all. And the weird thing that I was not aware of, so this is the story that you always get, right? There was a mass panic. People really went for it. Here's evidence that people actually, started getting out their guns and fighting the Martians and whatever. And even that might have been kind of maybe not fabricated, but at least inflated. So it's not really clear how many people actually acted on this. So that could be kind of a hoax or a fabrication happening on different levels. So that's kind of a really well-known one. That's just kind of a, be careful what you hear on the media. How many people know this one, the spaghetti tree? So it was just April 1st. It's kind of fun to go back and look at that video. So that was a broadcast describing the spaghetti crop in Switzerland and showing in great detail, you can kind of see it here, spaghetti hanging off the trees and these Swiss farmers harvesting the spaghetti and describing why it was growing so well that year. Completely absurd. None of us would fall for that. At the time, however, in the UK, spaghetti was actually a very rare thing, so most people ate it from cans if they ate it at all. And then a lot of people called in and said, well, how do I grow my own? And that was kind of the advice that the BBC gave. So obviously we've come a long way in avoiding those kinds of hoaxes. And you might think that the internet actually makes this a lot better, right? So something like this, Wikipedia, how would that make that better? How would that help maybe avoid that kind of thing very quickly? How many people here trust Wikipedia, for instance, maybe exactly for that reason? So how would that help avoid that? Probably you all do, yeah. Constantly fact-checked, right? It has kind of a inbuilt self-correcting mechanism, right? What else? Everything has sources. The articles tell you how well they are sourced. People can edit them, so there's no single expert that you're relying on, but a whole cloud or a whole group of people. So those are good things. You have rapid availability of information, so if you were confused about the Mars attack, you would just Google it and see if there was independent corroborating evidence. How many people know this or are very good about, let's put it this way, Australian Aboriginal mythology? So some of you might have heard about this. I was very interested in this when I first got here, about Jar-Edo Wens, right, a god of earthly knowledge, who apparently played a big role in Australian Aboriginal mythology. Does anybody know this? Nobody knows this? So one thing is, if you look that up now, you wouldn't actually find much information on this anymore, but this was a Wikipedia article that was added in May 2005 anonymously. And the interesting thing here was that it fulfilled a lot of kind of those expectations that you would have of a good article, right? So it had links to other articles. It was mirrored on different sites. It was translated into various languages. So you would have found actually corroborating evidence. It wasn't kind of an orphan. And it was also not an article that just nobody saw, that just disappeared into nothing, right? And it was a complete hoax, and it was there for over 9 years. So what was actually going on there was the guy who created it was Jared Owens, and he was just seeing if basically he could do it, right? So that was a hoax. When I first did this lecture a year ago here at Monash, that was Wikipedia's longest living hoax. It no longer is. So if you're interested in this type of thing, the longest living hoaxes are now up to over 10 years. There's a long list of them, much longer than I could put here. They're all pretty weird. And obviously we don't know whether that list is exhaustive, right? So there probably are still a couple out there. So that seems to be a problem. So even Wikipedia, for instance, handle with care. So that's a fun thing to look at on your own. Now you might think, and this kind of takes it back to very old-fashioned cases, that the whole question is just one. So everything I've shown you so far is just really hoaxes, is some kind of quack deliberately deceiving other people, right? So a big question is going to be how to weed out exactly those examples, and maybe also how to identify in oneself which of those cases one is particularly prone to fall for. Because, for instance, one really wants a miracle cure for X, or one really wants to believe that Y, and so on and so forth. So that might be one aspect, which hopefully sometimes works, but here are some maybe more systematic questions that we can ask. And we're going to be looking at two kinds of sources. So we're going to be looking, first of all, at expert sources. So what counts, who or what counts as an expert source? And how do we deal with first-hand experience reports, including witnesses, for instance, in legal cases? So those would be roughly the two types of sources. And in both of those, there are going to be 3 types of questions that you can ask. And those are also going to be 3 questions that you have to answer in assignment task 3, and that we're going to be looking at in a bit more detail in the tutorials as well. So the first one is always going to be authority. Is the source actually in a position to know? Was the witness there to see the crime being committed? Or is the person actually the author of a text, or the journalist reporting on something, or the newspaper, or the blog where you've read this? Is this actually, do they have access to the relevant information? Do they have the relevant kind of expertise? And what would the relevant kind of expertise even be, right? The second is going to be trustworthiness, so that kind of asks a bit more about reputation. What else is known about the source? Is this typically a reliable person, or a reliable web page, a reliable blog, and so on and so forth? Is there reason to suspect bias? So does the person actually have a motive for deceiving you in any way, shape, or form? Or is there maybe a strong motive for telling the truth? So that might be another question to independently ask. Is there money being made? Is it April Fool's Day? And so on and so forth. And the third group of questions is going to be about corroboration. So is there independent evidence pointing to the same conclusion? Is there maybe also documented evidence? So I think especially in reading newspaper articles, for instance, that report on science and so on and so forth, or maybe report on what other experts are saying, it's kind of interesting to know who is the expert being cited, where exactly could I read up on this, reaching into scientific references. So that's also why referencing is so unbelievably important, especially, in academic writing. So those are kind of the 3 groups. So does the source really tell you where this information could be checked? Is it easily traceable? That's going to be another thing that will help evaluate a source and help substantiate an appeal to authority. So those are kind of the three general things, and now we'll see how they work out in some specific cases. So what would be an issue here? How many people read the study guide? Then you'll know this one. But I think everybody knows the effect, right? Anything Einstein says is going to just be true. Why? Well, because he says it. So what's the relevant question to ask here immediately? Or what? Why might you worry about this one?
Just because Einstein knew a lot about physics doesn't mean he knew a lot about other things.
So relevant expertise, just being the wisest person alive, he wasn't. So relevant kind of expertise, he's not necessarily in a position to know. It's obviously a toy example that hopefully you wouldn't always fall for, and you can think of many other kinds like this. Something like this. So this is Heidi Klum. You all know examples like this. German McDonald's advertisement, and then later for a burger chain in the U.S. as well. So celebrity advertisements. What type of area might you, or what question might be particularly relevant here? I mean, they're extremely effective, right, in the psychology of advertisement, but what would be the key question to ask here? So you could wonder, is the person in a position to know even, kind of burgers maybe not being the main, the main source of nutrition for a top model. Trustworthiness, right? So that would be a clear worry here, and we all know this in theory, but kind of tend to forget it nonetheless. So here there's a clear reason to suspect bias, right, on the side of the advertising company, on the side of the celebrity. This is obviously not something that is about reliable information, but you can find similar examples nonetheless. Leading expert tells us there's no danger of global warming. Well, what would you want there immediately? Yeah, it needs to be identified, right? And it also, aside from the fact that this is kind of so general that it basically has no informational content whatsoever, you would want to know who that leading expert is. So that would be the kind of thing where immediately corroboration. Who is that expert? How can I check it? Where can I get information on this? So that would be exactly the type of question to ask. And then you might get something like this, but there's no consensus, right? There are still people who deny this. There are still maybe even named experts who deny global warming. So kind of a related question you can ask about corroboration would be maybe not just, are there maybe several experts who disagree with this position, but actually how broad, how big is the agreement basis in general? So if somebody is saying something like this and maybe saying, pointing at individual researchers who deny global warming, then you might additionally want to ask how representative is that, right? If 97% agree, then that is a pretty solid agreement basis, and if 3% disagree, that's not enough to dispute a claim, right? So that kind of toy examples, but you can kind of see, I think, that those are the types of things that are out there. Now, the very same types of questions are going to be asked about witness reports, essentially, though they're often going to have a little bit of a different connotation there, right? So was the person actually there when the crime was committed? Were they actually able to see, hear, whatever, what they said they were able to see, hear, and so on and so forth? Again, do they have a motive? Do they have a relationship to the accused or whatever. Those are kind of clear questions. It gets interesting and it gets muddy, and that's something we'll be looking at a little bit in the toots as well, if you factor in a lot of other things. So in the study guide you had an example, was the witness able to see the car crash from this corner or not? Well, that might be one thing, but there's also a lot on the psychology of witness reports that suggests that if people are under stress, if they're confronted with certain types of leading questions and so on and so forth, they might not, their memory might not actually be very reliable, even if they're trying to tell the truth. So those are kind of things to think about as well, then also kind of thinking about how high are the stakes in that case and so on and so forth. And again, is there actually independent evidence from different sources? So that just kind of repeats a very similar thing. So I want to show you a bit of a more complex case study that is quite well known by now maybe, but that kind of nicely shows how a complex or a more complex example of evaluating the trustworthiness of a source might actually play out. And this is again an old one, so back in 2003 when Colin Powell was making the case for war against Iraq for the UN. And I don't know if you still remember this, I still remember this, clear evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, clear evidence that they had, even mobile kind of factories for producing biological biological weapons. There were actually pictures supporting this, so write down into the exact details of how this worked. So all of this looked very convincing and very frightening, and we all know what happened next. So on what was this actually based? Well, there was a source who claimed, was the source in a position to know? So this was all based on reports from a source who had furnished all of these descriptions. Did the source have the relevant kind of expertise? Actually looked good. So had a degree in chemical engineering, top of the class, good marks. So all of that sounds fairly reliable. Somebody like that, you might think, would know enough, to be able to be making these kinds of claims. Was also in the right place at the right time. So had actually been working in one of these mobile weapon laboratories after leaving university, so really was reporting from firsthand experience, was the argument. So in that respect, it looked quite good, solid case. And here's where things started then going terribly wrong. So what was the reputation for trustworthiness? Well, German intelligence in that case had already suspected that this person was mentally unstable, might be fabricating things, was known as a congenital liar. So all of that did not, or should have kind of raised alarms about the strength of this evidence. Motive, well, this person was also in the middle of seeking asylum, so had a strong interest for making that application as interesting as possible, and obviously having this type of highly sensitive information was going to strengthen the application for asylum. So that would have not fared so well on the trustworthiness question. Corroboration, well, actually no independent evidence, and as we now all know in retrospect, really was able to be found. A lot of these images were just plain computer generated based on these first-hand accounts. And intelligence agencies also didn't really do the background checks, even if they could have, right? So that was another way where that went wrong. Maybe something on images. So this type of thing is terribly convincing psychologically, right? If you can produce a kind of image or picture of something, that is something that is going to convince people. And we also saw something similar in the H.G. Wells case, right? The mass panic, people running out to fight the Martians. That's the message people will believe, even if it's kind of fabricated or staged. What else about corroboration? And this is where it gets even worse. So multiply translated interviews that then probably also had multiple issues, and multiple things were probably lost in translation, memory failures, then checking was the person actually where the person had said they were, actually not. A number of things, if the fact-checking had been done, actually didn't follow through. So the case looked increasingly wobbly on all of those levels. And that actually would have undermined the whole appeal to authority in the first place. So much of this was just built on trusting the source itself. So authority, not really clear, right? At least at first it looked good, but then later, and especially in hindsight, that kind of broke down. Trustworthiness overall very low, and this is also corroboration and independent documentation, checkability of the claims, all of that actually very bad. And we all know that no WMD were actually later found in Iraq. So this was, kind of a relevant mistake to make, and it happens on the very highest levels. So that just kind of is an example of how to follow through with that kind of an evaluation, and also to see that this happens even on high levels and is something that really is important. So how does one deal with that then? I'm just going to skip over this one. Is it just an issue of avoiding quacks or of avoiding obvious hoaxes? Also not necessarily. How many people know the clever Hans phenomenon? So a couple, but most people don't if you're still raising your hands at this point. So Amazing Horse, who was able to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, relatively complex math problems, and he'd do this by tapping his hoof. And he was this huge, this horse was this huge kind of fair attraction, that people really loved it, incredibly intelligent. And then along came the psychologist Oskar Funkst, who was able to show that the horse was actually responding to body language in its trainer. And the thing was, the trainer didn't know this. So this wasn't even a deliberate hoax, right? This was kind of a subtle form, maybe of experimenter demand, which you might have in human psychology, so observer expectancy effect. So kind of unwittingly creating exactly the signals that produced the kinds of responses that one wanted to have. Obviously, everybody also wanted to see this intelligent performance, but it just wasn't there, right? So that's a well-known thing. That's another thing to be careful of when evaluating. But that's also something that was even at work in the long example that I just talked you through, right? So even on the level, here we have someone from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, so the German intelligence agencies that had warned the CIA that this guy wasn't reliable, that he wasn't trustworthy. Then these people later came to think, well, if the Americans are relying on this evidence, then it must be better than we thought. So kind of confirmation bias on multiple levels, right? And maybe not always intentional. So we actually have a very rich mixture here of bias, motivation, unwitting or perhaps unwitting error, witting deception, and so on and so forth. So kind of old obvious things with sometimes new and big consequences. So that's a bit of the background on evaluating arguments. On the assignment, you'll be having those. You'll basically be having two different examples of texts taking different positions on the same claim, and then you'll have to say, you know, how trustworthy, how good is the authority, how good is the documentation, is there independent evidence, and so on and so forth. Are there questions at this point? Because then we'll look at some more ways, or some ways of naming informal fallacies that are related to these kinds of arguments from authority. And that's the second part. And again, none of this probably is going to be terribly new to you, but these are kind of good to keep in mind because these are the types of arguments that you're often going to be confronted with. And just kind of knowing what they are is a nice way of responding to them. So the basic argument from authority is always going to be something like this, right? Person A claims something to be the case on a certain subject. Person A is also claimed to be an authority on that subject, so that claim must be true. And we've seen many examples in which this doesn't work. But the thing to see here is that this appeal to authority sometimes can and sometimes won't be good evidence for accepting a conclusion. And this is unlike, if you remember, kind of the formal fallacies that we talked about earlier in the semester. So things like when we were talking about modus ponens and modus tollens, so things like that. Affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent. Those were formal fallacies. So if you had that kind of thing, the very structure of the argument was bad. Informal fallacies are not just a matter of structure. So this kind of argument can, in some cases, be a good argument, and in other cases can be a bad argument. And everything is going to hang, in such cases, on the way you actually evaluate that source, on the way you actually evaluate the expertise or the eyewitness testimony. In that case, that is one of the premises in the argument. And you can think of many variations of this as well, right? So it's not always going to be witness X said so-and-so, or this is a internationally renowned researcher saying so-and-so, so we must believe that it is true. A version of that would be exactly something like this. I was there myself, I saw it myself, so I know that this really happened, or we all know, the majority of people know, it's common knowledge that. Those would be kind of generalized versions of an appeal to authority, and we've also seen several cases where there's just kind of like a vague and hand-waving appeal, right? Leading experts say where they're not even named. So those are different forms that this can take. And an important thing, so I was saying, that's an informal, that can be a type of informal fallacy. So the interesting thing then becomes, what do you do if the appeal to authority is or isn't substantial? What does that actually tell you about the truth or falsity of the conclusion? And that's where you have to be really careful. So the first thing is, if an appeal to authority is substantial, that person is identified, it is a good authority, all signs point to accepting that evidence. And that's going to be the standard case. That's what we do all the time and rightly do all the time. That doesn't mean that the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. It can still be false, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. And the second thing that is maybe even more important, because it's easy to overlook, is if the appeal to authority is bad, that doesn't show that the conclusion is necessarily false. It just shows that you don't have sufficient reason for accepting the conclusion. That's all it shows. It just shows that you would need a different argument or different reasons for accepting the truth of the conclusion. It doesn't really tell you anything about the conclusion itself. So the important thing, and that leads us to the next point, and that's why I'm emphasizing this so much, is that just because an appeal to authority is bad, or just because somebody is not an authority on something, that isn't enough to disprove a conclusion and to actually try to argue against it. Does anybody know what a form of argument is called where you're trying to argue against a claim by undermining someone's authority? Yeah, the argumentum ad hominem. So that's one to be careful of and to also be aware of when it happens, right? So something like this, very popular because it's easy to do, it's still a horrible thing to do. Person A makes claim X, but they're not trustworthy, they're somehow, maybe they're biased, maybe they're just a horrible, unfriendly person for some reason, so the claim should be rejected. Whether a claim is true or false is completely independent, of course. We know this in theory, right, of the person who is putting it forth. But we're all easily deceived by that kind of a thing, right? And it's often masked. So I'm going to be fair. I'm not going to even mention my opponent's problem with X or background with Y. I don't care about that. I'm a very neutral person. So then you're subtly manipulating your audience, right? That's a subtle form of character assassination if you're doing that, or kind of disguising the attack in various other ways. So that's just something to pay attention to when it happens, and then you can immediately say that's fallacious reasoning. Another form of it, actually a specific variant of attacking somebody's character, right? How many people have seen arguments like that, or who has an example of an argument that might, of an actual case that works like that? So somebody makes a claim, and then somebody else says that their own behavior contradicts this claim, and that's supposed to undermine the argument. I mean, this is something we constantly do. No examples? Yeah.
I'm not really sure, but let's just say it was like, the dad and the kid, and the dad saying to the kid, hey, don't smoke, because they typically smoke, so why should
Sure. Sure, why should I listen to you? It can't be unhealthy because you do it yourself. It can't be unhealthy because you did it yourself when you were young, so I have the right to do this as well. Well, you say that vegetarianism is healthy, you know, and that that's the ethical thing to do, but, you know, you're wearing leather shoes yourself or have a leather purse, and so on and so forth. So this is endless. How can you say that climate change is happening when you yourself drive a car, and so on and so forth, right? Or something like this. So basically, look who's talking. Your character is insufficient to put forth that type of argument. That's a character assassination. Yeah?
Do you think that it can be valid? Like someone's like preaching some way of life, living life, do as I say, do as I do.
Well, would that, do you think that in it, so the question to ask is whether that in itself would be sufficient grounds for undermining the conclusion. Strictly speaking, we need to separate those questions, right? So we might want to say, and this is where it's tricky, person X has a strong motive to be deceiving us, whatever. If all that is true, then we might not want to believe whatever they're asserting. So that might not, their testimony might not be a good reason for accepting the conclusion. That's true. But just because they're not trustworthy, that doesn't disprove the conclusion either. So it's just completely independent of that. In theory, we should just evaluate how good the arguments are. It doesn't really matter who the person is who's putting forth the argument. Those are completely, in theory, completely independent things. Would you want to be friends with a person who constantly preaches one thing and does something else? Probably not. So it does have something to do at some point with character, maybe. But
It's not the validity of their argument.
yeah.
It affects how persuasive it is.
Sure. And we do this all the time, and it's impossible to keep apart because, of course, also those snap judgments we make about reliability are often going to be informed by things like that. And it's also a very convenient way to shoot down somebody, but it's not a good way. So if you're criticizing somebody's claim, actually go for the reasons that are relevant to it, right? And don't try to engage in character assassination, which is just irrelevant to the claim, right? Okay, so here's a final one. And this is also a very popular one, a popular informal fallacy, and that's the argument from ignorance. And the argument from ignorance, so the ones we've seen so far were all about people. Who is the person putting forth the argument? Is it an expert, so we should believe it? Is this an untrustworthy person, so we shouldn't accept the claim, and so on and so forth? Do their actions align with what they say, yes or no? This is a bit different because this one says, well, claim X is still open, so it hasn't been proved, so it must be true or it can't be true. One of those things. Yeah.
The same sort of thing as the absence of evidence is evidence.
Yeah. That's pretending that the absence of evidence would show you something and would actually license you to strong conclusions, but typically it doesn't, right? So there are exceptions to that, right? So unless proven guilty, you're treated as if you were innocent. But strictly speaking, and I mean, obviously this is a toy example that nobody would fall for, but you can think of ones that are better, and we'll see some later on. Just saying that something has not been proven or disproven doesn't actually license any strong conclusions. Yeah. So let's see some examples of that. So what is going on here in this one? What kind of fallacy is being committed, if you think of those different ones? So bias is being claimed. Which one would that be? I mean, that would mean that you probably shouldn't accept the conclusion either, so there would be certain worry about the authority here. But this is a personal attack, right? This is just really attacking a person rather than an issue. So you kind of see that there's an asymmetric relationship here, right? You don't accept somebody's claim unless you believe that they're a trustworthy source, but you don't attack somebody's claim by attacking their character. That's a no-go. Okay. What about something like this? Which one is being committed? Nobody's talking to me anymore. I've talked way too much this week. So, yeah, so number one, right? So that's a sketchy appeal to authority, just not relevant. That's like the Einstein example that we had earlier. No one has objected to the new healthcare policies, so they must be very effective. The argument from ignorance. That doesn't show it, right? There could be many reasons why nobody has objected to the healthcare policies. Just not knowing, no evidence of inefficiency doesn't show that they're effective, yeah. And then we have exactly one of those cases of guilt by association that I already mentioned, and I think that, again, a hugely popular one. So those were just some examples to keep in mind, and maybe also to react to arguments that you're confronted with when you're confronted with them, to debunk informal fallacies. This is what we'll be doing next week, and then I'll see you in the tutorials, and we'll look at some real examples.